Thanks for joining me, Liam, of Feedback Global. I really appreciate taking time to be on this podcast. And I think what you guys are doing and what we're doing is very, very closely aligned. But before we get into that, would you tell me what has led you in your life to be sitting in the chair where you are talking to me here?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you for having me on, Glenn. Delightful to be here. Um, I'll talk a little bit through how I got here in the first place. So I joined Feedback Global about 6 months ago now. I had originally worked in and around the environment sector, but for me, it was food that really kept cropping up at the forefront of my mind whenever I had environmental conversations. It became really apparent that making the correct changes to the food system was where we could see the biggest difference in the short term and the long term, with a range of other benefits as well for health and for social well-being and community. So personally, I think that journey started after I finished university, and I was a little bit lost. And I started meeting many people who are interested in animal welfare, started to learn more about it, and the more time I spent researching and learning my own time, the more I found out we were continuing a lot of really dysfunctional practices that I'd like to help as part of C.L.E.A.R and as part of Feedback Global put an end to.
What did you study? What was your
I think
degree?
so. I studied politics. I did a little bent towards sustainability at the end, looking at the family structure as a political structure as far as environmental decision making goes for consumers. But I think the reason that I was driven is because my dissertation, which I wrote on that family structure as a political unit, I sort of began to feel a little bit like my dissertation had been a waste of time because of the way that families and individual decision makers were up against a whole host of really abominable industry practices that made it impossible in the current form for them to make good decisions for themselves, even if they believed they were making good decisions.
That's really
So I had to
interesting.
scrap my dissertation in the end.
You scrapped it in the end. No way. So did
I
you change
submitted
it?
it
Did
and
you
I,
have to
and
do
I
a
got
different
my
one?
grade, but
Right, right. Interesting.
so I submitted it. I submitted it and I got the grade, and then I quickly disavowed it in my own
Right.
personal spaces.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
the food element of it, are you just a keen eater, chef, is super interested in nutrition? Where did all that come from? I mean, when I say chef, I mean I just like a keen. Are you a foodie basically?
I do love my food. I do, yeah. I love living in London as a source of trying new foods, and the global cuisines here are amazing. Kingsland Road Vietnamese food is my personal favorite,
Brilliant.
and you can get really good plant-based meals on Kingsland Road. So I'd recommend that to anyone who's in the Old Street area. And also living around where I live in West London, lots of really great falafel places. So
Oh,
I find
where are
myself
you? Where are you now? Well, I mean,
I'm
where do you live?
in West Westbourne Park area. Lots of really good falafel in that sort of area around Portobello Road.
Oh, right. I'm in Queen's Park,
Are
so
you
we're
in the
only
same sort of area?
yeah, we're only a mile and a half away from each other. And I used to live down
Uh,
on Harrow Road, really near where you are now. That's funny. Um, okay, so are you? Is Feedback based in London then? Are they organization based here?
yes, Feedback Global is based in Northeast London, so we have our offices in Tottenham,
Right.
but we do a lot of remote working. And we also have a sister organization, Feedback EU, which is set up in the last few years, which is based in the Netherlands.
Right.
And they do all sorts of similar work that links up with ours, but in the European Union policy space and in the Netherlands specifically as well.
I guess that makes sense having kind of two branches, one that's still in Europe and one that unfortunately isn't, or depending on your viewpoint on that. But uh, tell us what feedback is then, I think, because we haven't got there yet. So tell us what
Yeah.
do you do?
So Feedback Global is a sustainable food campaigning organization. So we're a charity funded by foundations, and we are best known for our work on food waste, which is where we started. But now we work across a range of campaigns. So that's on meat and dairy, the quality of meat and dairy, and also the quantity of meat and dairy, but also on sugar, aquaculture, mainly on the feed elements of aquaculture. We do divestment campaigns from big livestock. We have reparations projects. Really, we work wherever we see an opportunity to try and make a difference.
How I mean, something like waste, I think it's fairly kind of straightforward. Is anything that can be either reappropriate waste products, reuse them, upcycle them is obviously a good thing. But I know there's a lot of controversy regarding making biofuels and things from waste. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
I can try a little bit. It's not my
Okay,
expert area. My
sure.
colleagues Martin and Ayuk are the best choices for that one. Um, so the main gripe we can take that I'm familiar with is, sorry, my phone is ringing. Let me turn that one off. Yeah, sorry. I'll
I
start
didn't
again.
hear a thing, but that's okay.
Oh, okay. Next time I'll leave it. Um, yeah, there's a slight problem with anaerobic digestion. So attempting to make fuels from decomposing waste,
Hmm.
essentially. One of the key problems is at scale, it can create um, a false incentive to produce more waste and not to cut waste down. So you might end up actually incentivizing industrial production of meat and dairy and other animal products so that you can get the waste to fuel and make worth the massive capital investment that goes into the anaerobic digesters in the first place.
So the waste becomes a
I know
valuable commodity, you mean?
the
Kind of.
waste becomes a commodity and a co-product of the industrial production, which
Right.
helps prop up the industrial production further. So some big problems there, definitely to be observed. And we would also say that there are better uses for the waste in a lot of cases. The first use is not to make the waste in the first place. So more
Yep.
efficient, more efficient production, packaging, consumption, and public education. And secondarily, how we started as an organization is that pig feed can be made out of most forms of food waste. There are all sorts of new technologies attempting to make use of food waste for chicken farming as well. Those still need to be proven a bit further, but the core idea is that food waste doesn't have to be thrown into a giant churning pit and turned into biogas when it could more efficiently be used to cut the carbon footprints of other foods.
Yeah, I can. When you were talking about that, and you sort of said, I kind of clicked what you were going to say, that the waste could become a valuable asset in its own right, and it reminded me of what's happened with soy, basically. So the soy that's grown on the Amazon is pressed for oil, which is worth $2,500 a ton, but the seed meal after pressing is which makes up 75% of the weight, is $400 a ton. So it's got to the point where, weight for weight, the byproduct of pressing oil is almost as valuable as the oil itself. And of course, that then ends up feeding poultry and pork. So you've got something that's effectively a waste product that isn't. And you could argue that it's upcycling, but the industrial farming is driving the need for both those things to exist. If it was only the oil on its own, the industry wouldn't exist. If it was only animal feed on its own, it wouldn't exist either. So it's kind of double feeding, and I can see how that could be a problem. But yeah, it's really interesting. The whole idea of course, the reason that we keep pigs, and pigs are a part of our food chain, is that they were nature's recyclers. Pigs would have eaten all of our food waste before we had bins and refuse collection and things. And there's regulations, I believe, that human food waste, can't be fed to pigs. It used to be called swill. And I think there are some campaigns, right, to be able to heat treat food waste from, domestic schools, hospitals, whatever, and just upcycle those nutrients. Is that something you guys are involved in as well, or is that not a part of your?
Not me directly. No, we've moved away from the pig idea a little bit in terms of our campaign priorities, but we do suggest different routes in public procurement to try and support the kind of food system that we like through
Right.
the public sector. So where public sector money is being spent on food procurements, it should be done in a way that's targeted to help produce the kind of food that we want, not just the food that we have and that we can provide cheaply.
I think even in that, I know you're also we've only talked about waste so far, but I know you're also involved in aquaculture and livestock. I think something that's super interesting in which you've highlighted in the waste reduction, is nothing is ever black and white in these arguments, because there are so many gray areas. And I think this is one of the points that C.L.E.A.R tries to make, is you can't just say something is good or bad. And you've really brilliantly highlighted it with, the example of waste. And I think it's also true with livestock agriculture. In some ways, it could be argued, this is not my position and it's not clear position, but that factory farming of poultry, for example, is in a very cheap and efficient way of producing protein. I think factory farming should be completely ended in every way because there's no ecosystem services, there's no balance in there. But it's how do you guys at Feedback, when you take on, how do you surf that gray area and look at best practice and not get caught up in the kind of dialectic, this is right or wrong?
As an organization, we do a lot of research and due diligence. We produce a lot of research reports in our own right, and we also work with academics to produce academic papers and peer-reviewed journals. So, for example, on our work in aquaculture, we were skeptical about the expansion of industrial aquaculture. So that's fish farming. For those who aren't familiar with the lingo, it's a word I only learned a few months ago.
Okay.
We were suspicious of the quick expansion of aquaculture and in its industrial form across the UK and across Europe. But really, we wanted to get to the root of it because it's paraded by a lot of groups as a low carbon way of producing proteins, which whenever somebody's making that kind of claim about a new technology, it's our role to look into it and assess it. And looking critically at the more detailed elements of it, we were able to find quite a few problems, which we think give pause to the rollout of it for policymakers. So first of all, with research we sponsored, we managed to track the micronutrient path from wild caught forage fish, which are used as food for farmed fish, and found that actually we can lose up to 99% of certain micronutrients from those fish by the time it actually gets to your plate. So all of the fish that are being caught in places that are food insecure throughout the world, so Vietnam, Senegal, mostly we work in West Africa. We have a campaign called Our Fish, which is run between our UK and EU bases. We're finding in food insecure places having their forage fish taken away. So that's missing from their diet. It's causing a lot of unemployment for women, particularly. There's a massive social justice problem there. It's being turned into fish meal and fish oil, brought to Europe, and then used to feed luxury fish in industrial farming with a massive micronutrient loss, a macronutrient loss to a smaller degree, huge welfare standard problems with farmed fish. The sea louse problem is getting out of hand and is really difficult to track, although wild fish are doing a great job trying to do that. And there's also plastic runoff, what we found coming from these farms. Some of them are floated on polystyrene in open water, and that polystyrene breaks away. That's been found in Scotland. And also wastewater, chemical byproducts, you name it, any sorts of problems that you can link to animal agriculture in its current industrial form. You can also link to aquaculture in its current industrial form. So it was all about doing that research and digging into the supply chains, building on research by changing markets as well to find the problems that on the surface weren't being made apparent.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say on the surface weren't being made apparent, because I see this all too often, this kind of myopic focus on carbon, as a metric of carbon either reduction or sequestration or balance, and forgetting all the other elements that go into that, including, of course, as you brilliantly put there, the social justice side of things, the human element. So apart from talk to me a little bit, because obviously C.L.E.A.R was born slightly out of Pasture for Life. The people involved in C.L.E.A.R were involved in Pasture for Life, and Pasture for Life is obviously a very sort of singular focus on certifying that grass-fed means grass-fed, whereas the DEFRA rules allow the use of the term grass-fed to apply to predominantly grass-fed. So it was almost like a sort of natural progression of the idea behind Pasture for Life that has created the C.L.E.A.R campaign, is that food labeling isn't clear. And before we started this recording, I asked you, what are your two big what are your big food label annoyances? What are the things written on packets in the supermarkets that really get under your skin? So spit it out. Tell me you think the biggest problems in food labeling at the moment. You froze there for a minute, Liam, but I think you're back.
So Feedback did a little bit of research, and we found. Okay, back.
You're
Sure.
back, I think. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, do correct me again if I'm wrong. Um, so Feedback did a little bit of research in supermarkets, and we had a campaign called Total Bull where we found that supermarkets were attempting to connect with customers around their industrial meat products by labeling them as coming from certain farms with positive names and positive associations to make them feel very good about those purchases. But in fact, what we found was a lot of those farms didn't even exist to be linked to in the first place. So the labeling of fake farms definitely gets under my skin because you're taking away even the most basic ability to do due diligence on supply chains when consumers are trying to make decisions. And secondly, responsibly sourced, which comes up in fish packaging a lot, doesn't really mean anything.
Anything. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm really glad you said responsibly sourced because that one absolutely drives me crazy as well. But I didn't I had heard that yeah, these supermarkets were making sub brands called I don't know, Haringey Farm or whatever, I just made that up. But but they were actually creating brands with the word farm in the name, but actually the meat's coming from industrial supply chain. Is that kind of what you're referring to? And it's completely, I mean, it's greenwash at its absolute worst. And there's
It's
absolutely no
greenwash at its worst. We've been doing a lot of work. Yeah.
how so did you have any victories on that one?
Um, it's difficult to measure at the moment, I think. That wasn't my project directly. I've joined after that's taken place. So I think we've moved away from it as a main focus with the supermarkets. I think they've moved on to other forms of greenwashing at the moment. Um,
So tell me what you're working on personally at the moment with feedback.
Yeah. So at the moment with feedback, I've been working across our fish campaigns that we talked about briefly, working on the sugar campaign, which is starting again in earnest. And predominantly my time is spent looking at supermarket greenwash. So the food retail sector in the UK is highly concentrated between just 10 supermarkets controlling about 95% of the market share. And what we've found is that all of them are engaging in a very similar playbook of greenwashing techniques to try and disguise the emissions of their products,
Oh,
especially
yeah, tell me
industrially
more.
produced meat and dairy, which
Right.
have an incredibly, sorry,
Yeah,
there a
we've got
connection
a bit
issue
of a
there.
bad connection here.
Okay, I will on this Wi-Fi. Okay,
Okay.
how is that? Is that any better?
Yeah, you're good at the moment. So no, I really want to dig into this. So tell me what you found. What you said the 10 supermarkets have a really similar playbook. What are the methods that they use and what I'm going to give you two questions here. So what are the methods that they use and what can the average shopper do to kind of see through this and make better decisions?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because I'm very fresh off this research at the moment.
Brilliant. Right.
Looking across the 10 supermarkets, what we're finding is a little bit of talk around climate emissions. So their carbon emissions predominantly, they will talk about scope 1 and 2 emissions. So those are emissions that come from the actual running of the stores and a little bit from their transport, their energy, refrigeration. So the things that we're used to hearing supermarkets talk about when they're talking about their carbon neutrality, particularly, and a little bit when they talk about net zero. But actually, between 90 and 98%, depending on the supermarket, of their emissions are coming from scope 3 emissions. So that's stuff that they produce, it's from their supply chains and the use of the products. Um, and then when you dig into that figure even further, you find that around 50% is from uh, fresh meat, dairy, and fish products. So those are very high emissions individual products because of the way that they're produced.
Mhm.
Um, and there's very little transparency to finding out why those emission figures are so high. A lot of the times they will be higher than reported because those ones will be based on assumptions made by carbon tracking companies rather than by detailed supply chain investigations by the supermarkets themselves. Hopefully, they're picking up on that a little bit. We're trying to put the pressure on them to do so.
Right.
But even with that research, we found that the supply chains are very opaque. And when they make commitments to, for example, stopping deforestation with their soy, we co-sponsored and co-published a report with Mighty Earth that found actually the bigger supermarkets like Tesco were still engaging in deforestation against their own pledges. So we've got an incredibly troublesome landscape where it's hard to assess the climate impact of supermarkets. And then as an individual consumer, it becomes even more difficult because the labeling is very unclear. A lot of the times we will find these industrial meat and dairy products slapped with labels that will refer to a small element of the packaging of the product. And while we obviously do want less plastic, if you're trying to persuade a consumer that the environmentally friendly choice is an industrial beef steak fed on soy from deforestation in the Amazon, but it's got 70% less plastic than it did a year earlier, you're probably incentivizing the wrong decisions and leading people down the wrong choices in their own attempts to be environmentally
the
friendly.
old bait and switch idea, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, the old bait and switch.
So I guess the second part of the question was what can consumers do is, I guess, just be a bit more diligent, right? Just like read between the lines a bit more. Is there anything in particular, though? Is there any kind of, like, for example, if you're encouraging people to, if people are eating beef and dairy, does it make sense to look at the packet and at least try and source from the UK or buy organic when you can? How would you advise people who are sort of, they're omnivores, they're eating, fruit, veg, meat, and dairy from around the, whatever's in a big supermarket? How do you navigate Tesco, Sainsbury's, whatever, and to make better choices? Is it just knowing that these tricks are being played, or are there certain standards that they can't lie about, and things that when they say, actually mean something?
So I would say that there are two ways to approach it. The first is how you spend your money, and the second is what you can do as what we would call a food citizen. So that's somebody who's engaging actively in the food system. So the first part, in terms of when you go into the supermarkets and you're trying to make good decisions, less and better is always the call. Mm-hmm. So if you can try and have a diet that's less reliant on meat and dairy, and where you are involving meat and dairy in your diet, to try and pick meat and dairy that's produced less intensively. Yep. That would be the first thing. Secondarily, as a food citizen, you can engage by checking the Advertising Standards Authority. So you're able, as a consumer, right, to report to the Advertising Standards Authority where you think you have detected greenwash, and they will investigate those claims and they can alter the way in which advertising standards are done. So recent guidance just came out that says companies aren't allowed to submit a small thing that they're doing without the greater context. So that comes from Shell talking about their renewable energy without talking about all of their oil and gas projects. The same may now be true in supermarkets and in food retailers. If they tell you that there's one little good element, for example, UK sourced, but they don't tell you about the industrial elements of it, the feed, where the feed comes from, and attempting to produce that as an environmental claim, then that's somewhere where you can step in and report.
That would be amazing. That's fantastic. That's really good advice. Actually, I'd like to try and, with the notes from this podcast episode, if you could supply me some links to include with that. I think that'd be really valuable. I kind of half expected you to say, don't shop at supermarkets wherever you can, as well, because I think that's sort of part of my advice. And funnily enough, I was talking to Fidelity earlier today, who's just outside of London. And, you and I live in West London, and I try wherever I can to buy my vegetables from Notting Hill Farmers Market or Queen's Park on a Sunday. And, I try and buy my meat and dairy either from there or from the ethical butcher, which I used to work at. But I just think if you can source your food from a shorter supply chain, the transparency is greater. And supermarkets are at least 5 points usually in the supply chain. Is it 4 or 5? It can be, you probably know this much better than I do. But, I love being able to go to a farmer's market. And, if I go to Notting Hill Farmers Market on a Saturday, quite often the guys who actually pulled the broccoli out of the grounds are the ones selling it to you. And so there's a pride in having that conversation, and the quality is there, and it costs more money. So if it starts going a bit slimy in the bottom drawer of the fridge, you don't bin it. You think, I need to cook that today. I just think there's a different reverence for it when you pay more. And I think that also links into the less but better. If you've paid, let's say you paid, £8 or £9 for a steak because it's organic in a supermarket, as opposed to paying £3 or £4, if you haven't used it by the sell-by date, you're more likely to not throw it away than throw it away. I think more expensive, better sourced food creates less waste as well. Do you think that's the case?
I think better sourcing food and having it through shorter supply chains is always a good thing,
Right.
and being able to source it locally as well. So we have local community projects that operate around the UK, particularly in Liverpool, where we have our Queen of Greens bus. So that's run by my colleague Lucy Antal and Keenan Humble and Rebecca. What they do is they go to areas where people don't have access to that kind of fresh food, where it's harder to engage with those shorter supply chains, and they provide the green groceries below market cost effectively to
Wow.
people,
Right.
so that they can produce their own meals at home, and make sure that those meals are chock full of good stuff rather than bad stuff. We do have to be aware that not everybody is able to access those places, so we're obviously trying to make that a bit easier. We've also got community kitchen projects in Sussex that help to teach people how to cook nutritious, cheaper meals themselves.
Yeah.
However, we do have to look at the food system as a whole, and that's really where feedback focuses. So the individual consumer who might not have a lot of money, not a lot of time, not a lot of expertise, and that's most people in the UK, especially at the moment with the cost of living crisis as it is, they need essentially the system to be constructed around them to help push them into better choices and help get them away from things that are bad for them and bad for the planet. So one of the things that we would support, and that we've written into the Labour Party policy forum as one of our recommendations, is to use the power of public procurement for these smaller projects, local producers, people who are making things in a sustainable way. So where we have hospitals and schools spending billions collectively, and local councils as well spending billions collectively on food, we need to make that focus on stimulating growth in the kinds of production systems that we want to see in the UK, rather than just those that we're stuck with at the moment.
Yeah, actually, that's really interesting, because I know that there's other members of the consortium who are kind of working on this problem, and I interviewed on Monday. I interviewed Rich, who's his company, Rich Osborne, EM Food, and that's kind of what he's doing, is he's trying to empower the much smaller suppliers to be able to get into public procurement. So individual farmers can connect directly with public procurement. So I think, you'd like the work that he's doing. He's doing it through like a tech-based platform that's making it easier for those connections to be made. But if we can duck back to the confused shopper in the supermarket, obviously, the less but better with meat and dairy. I agree with you. I'm kind of very much behind that. I think we need to do everything we can to end factory farming. I'm a great supporter of anything that's more agroecological style farming. But what I've seen is the food industry use the classic playbook to then take that narrative, that idea of thinking of meat reduction, and produce alternatives that are just as bad, overpriced, considering they're often made from cheap commodity crops, and as replacements to the meat and dairy, which are actually, I believe, a lot of them are not equivalent in terms of human health. They're not as bioavailable. Is that something that you're taking on as well? Are you looking at this sort of the greenwash, which I believe you may not agree with me, and please feel free to not agree with me, but I think there's an equal amount of greenwash in the plant-based foods startups and replacements, if you like. Is that something that you guys are looking at as well?
So we are looking at our position on alternative proteins. at the moment. So that's those kinds of brands that you see, Meatless Farm, which was in trouble, and Vegetarian Butcher and things like that. So our stance is that we really want to see it prove and deliver on the claims that it's making at the moment, because right now we're not really seeing the results that were promised. So one of the key arguments for these products is that they are replacing meat and dairy in people's diets, and normally replacing industrially produced meat and dairy that's bad for people, bad for the planet, etc. But what we're actually seeing is from research sponsored by the University of Sussex, um, when those sales of plant-based alternatives go up, like alternative proteins, the sales of those traditional industrial produced meat and dairy products don't go down. So the question is, what is happening
Right.
with people's spending habits? Are they simply buying more protein, which might in itself be unsustainable? Are they buying these as an additional gimmick product, which might end up more likely go to waste? People consuming more? And if so, which people are consuming more calories? Is it
Where's it all
people
going? Yeah.
where is it all
Yeah.
going in the bin into people? It's hard to say. So we do have to engage meaningfully with how supermarkets and other retailers are going to promote these products and stop promoting the products that they know to be bad already. So cutting out their multi-buy deals, sorting out the way that they position products in supermarkets, and stopping advertising things that they know to be harmful, and actually using any kind of alternative protein, and preferably a whole food plant-based protein or a well-produced protein of another kind,
Yeah. Yeah.
to supplement people's diets. We have an opportunity to make people healthier as well as to make the planet healthier. But at the moment, the evidence seems to say that we're just selling more and producing more without actually coming to the conclusions and the goals that we want to see.
I wonder if people are like buying the meat alternatives because they think it's like a vegetable. You know, so instead of putting green things on their plate, that they're cooking the steak and then they're having the fake steak next to it because it's a vegetable or something. I wonder if there's a bit of that weird mentality going on. That's really fascinating research, that even though the sales of the alt proteins are going up, are you, of course, when people say alt protein to me, I also start thinking about, all the other stuff like insect protein and fermented protein. And I was at a conference yesterday where people were talking about lab grown meat. And I sat on a panel with Hoxton Farms who were making, lab grown pork fat, and another company called Redefined Meat. I find, I don't know if I don't know if personally that's something you've spent any time looking at, but I find that whole sector to be really fascinating. And I'm very conflicted as to what I think about it.
I've definitely found there's a lot of discussion around that in this sort of NGO space at the moment, people with really differing opinions. I had the pleasure of being at the Extinction or Regeneration Conference in London a few months ago, and it was a really hot topic, people talking about these alternative proteins and lab-grown meats. There's obviously the animal welfare standard of it. People do want to reduce factory farming, eliminate factory farming, and see this as an alternative to do that. But one of the problems that we have to face down is who is then producing these new products. If it is the, if it is the same companies, for example, Cargill, who are one of the world's biggest meat producers, are now also very big in this alternative protein space.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to recognize that they're trying to uphold both sides of their business model. This won't just be one clean transition for them. And so we can't expect them to deliberately try and place their alternative protein products in the way of their meat products, because that will hurt their bottom line. So we have to question where this corporate consolidation is happening, and try to make sure that whichever products we are buying as a replacement to what's in our diets at the moment is coming from a good place, is coming from a recognizable place, has supply chains that we can see, and that we know where the finance is coming from. That's one of the key things too.
Yeah, so it's probably as much as the who is the why, and if these are being done simply because some an opportunity has been identified, that's probably not the correct motivation for reducing impact. I think is probably the takeaway from that. So I know that you're sort of you personally, you're not sort of hugely involved in C.L.E.A.R, but I'd like to think that our what we're trying to do is very, very much aligned. Oh, actually, no, let's skip back a bit. You started talking about something I know absolutely nothing about, which was nicotinamide.
Neonicotinoid.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Which is a pesticide used in sugar. Can you tell me about that? Because and give me the very basic version. I know nothing about this topic, so please explain what you're doing there.
Yes. So we are currently doing research into sugar, and campaigning on sugar. So what we see as one of the problems with sugar, which is actually marketed by British sugar as a very sustainable crop because of all of the co-products that they make, actually has a whole lot of problems involved with it.
Right.
One of the key ones that we found is neonicotinoid use. And so this is publicly available information, but it's not very widely publicized. Neonicotinoids are a type of pesticide which are absolutely lethal for pollinators like bees. They are an environmental apocalypse in a bottle, and they are officially banned as pesticides.
But
However,
banned where? Like in the UK or
in the
globally?
UK,
Right.
except under special license. So the special license has been given to sugar beet farming for a few years in a row now. So they banned it and then subsequently allowed it several times on the bounce to help protect sugar beet
But is
crops.
that something you have to kind of apply for and say, I need to use it because this is going wrong, and then you get to use it? Or is it just kind of, if you're growing sugar beet, you're allowed to use it? How does that work?
There are certain mechanisms in place. So it's an industry-wide allowance. So the way that the sugar industry works at the moment is it's split between imports and domestically grown sugar, and that's roughly 50-50. The domestically grown sugar is a private monopoly run by British Sugar, the company. So they will
And that sugar beet is in this country. That's how we got
sugar
it.
beet, yeah,
Right.
grown in this country. So that is effectively the meet point between government and industry when it comes to growing sugar, and they agree certain criteria that have to be met in terms of like humidity conditions and what have you to save the crop.
Right.
Um, and those conditions are set so that obviously it's quite easily triggered at the moment and has been triggered a few times. So we've got neonicotinoid pesticides being sprayed across the country over a massive landmass, and doing real damage to local ecosystems to provide something which, despite minor roles as a preservative and an ingredient, is
We don't really need.
generally
Yeah.
generally quite bad for our health. We've
Yeah.
got
Yeah.
a massive oversupply of sugar. If you were to take the government recommended daily guideline amounts of sugar and times that by the population of the UK, assuming everyone was eating the recommended adult amount, the overall supply of sugar into this country is still 3 times greater than that. So we're eating
Wow.
3 times too much sugar, and we're putting in place specific harmful farming practices to grow more of it, rather than trying to use that land to grow something that's
More
actually
nutritious.
nutritious,
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
nutritious, and
Yeah.
also,
Yeah.
potentially for carbon sequestration as well.
Yeah, because I think the phrase overfed and undernourished kind of comes up in relation to
Yeah.
that. Sugar is kind of empty calories. But what about let's say someone is at the supermarket and they want to buy a bag of sugar to bake a cake. If you buy organic, are you sidestepping that problem? I'm assuming that pesticide can't be used on organic sugar. Do you know if that's the case?
I can't speak in too much detail about the way in which different types of sugar are produced. I could say that for most people, it is an avoidable product. You can buy organic um, organic foods that don't have to be sugar in your diet.
Sure.
You can
Right.
support the right kind of farming and support the right kind of diet without going out of your way to buy too much sugar. The main problem that we have with sugar is not the bags of sugar that you buy at home, because you might use that in baking every once in a while. I know I have a bag of sugar that's sat in my cupboard for about 6 months and I barely touch. It's more that it gets put into products, and it's really hard to know which products have what form of sugar in. So the labeling on the back of a product that just says sugar tells you nothing. It doesn't tell you if it's sugar beet, doesn't tell you if it's sugar cane, doesn't tell you where it's grown, doesn't tell you where it's come from, doesn't tell you if it's organic. Presumably it's not.
Yeah.
Presumably it's also dyed with bone char from industrial meat production, which is another co-product of industrial meat
Dyed
production.
or bleached. Is that how they
Bleached.
bleached?
Yeah.
Right. So that's how white sugar is made that way. I've no idea. So that's
Sometimes it is, yeah. It's how I'm personally I'm a vegan, so I try to avoid. I try to avoid animal products as much as possible for my own personal reasons,
Yeah.
and I cannot trust sugar in most products because I can't see where that's come from and see whether it's been bleached and whether that industrial farming has fed into a product that on its surface should have absolutely nothing to do with it. It
So
makes
you're
it really hard as a consumer.
indirectly using a byproduct of an industry that you don't
Mm,
agree with. I had no idea. So everything we're talking about here really is relating back to the fact that our food labeling system is completely inadequate. And not only inadequate, but the opaqueness of it is actually serving the industry very, very well because they can do what the hell they like.
yeah.
There's nothing mandatory that has to follow through. You know, you've there identified an amazing problem that I couldn't even imagine existed. That as a vegan, you wouldn't want to buy a bag of white sugar in the supermarket because you don't know that's so crazy. That's so crazy. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I could imagine it with like a jelly sweet or something that sometimes uses gelatin or pectin or whatever, and then it should say, but it's these kind of stealth processes that really need to be reflected. Which should be having method of production at farm data coming through. So we've been going on for a little bit now. Is there anything kind of tell me some good news? Tell me something that you guys at tell me some victories that you've had. Tell me some changes that you've actually made for the better.
Um, this is new for me. Trying to find the victories. Um,
Okay, maybe I'll rephrase that then.
yeah.
What do you think? What
Oh,
do you think you can do? Oh, okay, go on.
yeah, sorry. So recently we have been involved in the Court of Appeal with the government to try and push them to be uh, sorry, let me start that one again because
Sure.
this is a legal case. I don't want to mess this one up, otherwise my
Yeah,
boss will
yeah,
push
no,
the
get
button.
it right. Okay.
So so recently we had a victory in court. So this was at the Court of Appeals. We essentially found that the government's national food strategy was woefully inadequate and potentially, as we're going to find out in our next court case, illegal on the basis that it did not take into account adequately the findings of um, its own professional review and of the Climate Change Committee. So one of those victories for us is trying to hold the government accountable and make it clear that its role in the food system is not just to be the supporter of business and industry and GDP, but to support people's health, the future of the planet, and their diets across all of these ways. And I think food labeling is one of the ways that we will hopefully force businesses to be more transparent and allow people to make better choices. And if the government has to be the one to implement those, then let's speed them up. Let's hurry them up.
Excellent. Or at least mandate it, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's a really that's a really good way to kind of come sort of full circle. The other thing I'd like to ask you before we sign off is what can people do to support what you're doing? What's the best way of engaging with your campaigns? Are you very active, for example, on socials? Are you tell me what people can do to help support the work of feedback.
If you want to find out more about Feedback Global's work and Feedback EU, you can find us on all the key socials. So we post quite regularly on our website. That's feedbackglobal.org. We're also on LinkedIn. It's Feedback Global. We're on Twitter, same handle, and you'll find us with a very frequent email newsletter, which
Brilliant.
will give you lots of ways in which you can get involved directly in our campaigns and our campaign works. That's sending emails, writing letters, and joining in on our petitions.
Right. So if you really want to be active, the best thing to do is sign up for your newsletter and then get the feedbacks, and then you can actively engage with the campaigns that really resonate with you as a consumer and get involved. And on a sort of, I guess, lesser level is a bit of a like, share, and subscribe on the social channels.
Yeah, the classic like, share, and subscribe. But I would encourage the newsletter. There's lots of good stuff in there. Hopefully, coming up soon we should have some actions that involve the advertising standards I was talking about earlier,
Brilliant.
or maybe some other interesting ways of going about trying to hold retailers accountable for what they're selling.
Amazing. I think that's about wraps it up. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time
Super.
today,
Thanks,
Liam.
Glenn. That's great.